Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, sponsored by Fieldstone Memory Care, Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers innovative and compassionate care and now accepting residents. They also offer day stay and respite programs. Call 360-689-4314 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Rolling Bay today. And I would also like to acknowledge that the Seniors Community Center is on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water. And today we honor them as always. And today it is my pleasure to also listen and hear words of wisdoms and pearls from our good friend, Ann Lovejoy. Good morning, Ann Lovejoy.
Good morning, Karen. Yeah, we have an interesting thing happening right now. It's what's called a winter storm in May. So there's a lot of wind. Because there are leaves on the trees, we might see more damage than usual because those leaves add a lot of surface area. So some people were asking me this morning why branches are falling down that came through the winter just fine. Well, in winter they were bare, and so they only offered the surface area of the actual twigs and branches. But once they leaf out, those leaves act a bit like a sail, and they capture a lot more wind, and that's why we might see more big limbs down on a day like this with big gusts. That some of those gusts are supposedly going to reach 35 to 50 miles an hour. So I would not be surprised. And we may see power outages, as in fact we see in my neighborhood at this moment. I am coming to you from my phone, and so I will hopefully be able to stay on for the whole program, but let's see what happens, right?
Yes.
One thing I did want to talk about a bit is there's an exciting program called No Mow May. And the idea is, if you haven't mowed your lawn yet because it's been so wet and cold, that's a good thing. And you can just hold off a little bit longer. If you have mown, you just maybe don't want to mow again for the next few weeks. One of the biggest problems for pollinators early in the year, especially in a very cold, wet spring like this, is that there aren't really a whole lot of opportunities for them to get nectar and pollen. And so anything we can do, including allowing dandelions to bloom, is going to be really beneficial to them. It also provides a certain amount of shelter and protection for some of the little wild creatures. Many kinds of pollinators would maybe shelter under grasses and things like that. A mowed lawn doesn't really offer anything to the wild world at all. And in fact, mown lawns typically shed water at about the same rate as a concrete sidewalk. That's pretty impressive because the root system binds up the surface, and you'll see that a lot, that there's puddling and so forth on grassy areas that don't occur on garden beds, because the garden beds are much more porous and able to absorb and store water much better. So one thing that we can all think about too is not just not mowing in May, but giving those pollinators a chance, but also consider reducing your lawn area. Lawn covers about 2% of the United States and is responsible. It's the highest use irrigation crop in the United States. So it's using an obscene percentage of irrigation water for a very small amount of land, and an amount of land that does not give back anything at all. So getting rid of your lawn or minimizing your lawn is a great way to go. And this is a good month to think about. There's plant sales galore. And one of the things we can do is think about ground covers that serve better than turf. If you like a nice green area, you might think about putting in other kinds of ground covers that are more productive for pollinators and offer more opportunities for birds and little other creatures to find nest materials and so forth. There is basically no garden crop that requires to be fed and cut in half every week, right? The amount of energy and resources that go into those lawns is really pretty horrible, especially the pesticide burden, because lawns shed a great deal of water, a lot of the pesticides and fertilizers that are dumped on lawns gets washed away into the waterways and become really, really significant pollutants, doing a lot of harm to the environment and a lot of harm to fish and frogs and dragonflies and all kinds of wonderful things that we would rather not harm. So I'm really a huge advocate, as you probably have figured out, for reducing or eliminating lawns and putting in other plants as well. One thing we can think about is putting in plants that are going to do well as our climate shifts around. So I'm saying, we're seeing a lot of issues with some of the rhododendrons and some of the camellias that have been longtime garden standards up here in the Pacific Northwest. Some of them do not tolerate the summer heat or the dry winters that we've been experiencing. And I know it feels funny to talk about drought right now when we've just had quite a bit of rain, but in fact, the erratic nature of the rain pattern means the distribution in winter is not what it used to be. We have a modified Mediterranean climate, which means we generally have been able to expect wet winters and pretty dry summers. That's starting to shift quite a bit too. And what we're noticing is that a lot of native plants are getting stressed out. So what do we look for? We might look a little bit further south and maybe even a little bit further east and start planting things like California lilac, ceanothus, which are beautiful evergreen shrubs. Pollinators and birds love them. They're hardy, tough, they're very disease resistant. They can take many kinds of soil conditions. So they're really great kind of effortless shrubs to replace maybe some of the fuss pots that are not doing so well. And there's a lot of variety. There's actually ground covers forms that are 8 to 12 inches high, and there's towering forms that are 8 to 12 feet high. So you got a lot of choice in between, and a range of colors that include blue, dark blue, light blue, very light blue, pale blue. In other words, it's not really a wide range at all. But if you like blue, there's a lot of ceanothus for you. The other thing we might think about is we're having huge issues with salal. There's a lot of salal dieback, sword ferns dying out. So what do we do there? We might look at the manzanita clan a little further south and a little further east and see that there's a huge, huge range of very beautiful evergreen manzanitas that would fill the same ecological niche that salal has taken, especially in areas that are a little sunnier than they used to be as trees come down. So the manzanitas are another good family clan to start investigating and looking for. I did have a lot of questions about hardy fuchsias. Many people were sure their hardy fuchsias were dead. In fact, what I've noticed is that hardy fuchsias that were in shelter are just fine. For the most part, they leafed out fairly normally. They didn't even have a lot of dead wood. Hardy fuchsias, especially the big tall ones that got a lot of wind and windburn and were very exposed in those very cold mornings when it hit 17 and the whole top growth froze. But almost all of them, if they have an adequate root system, they're coming back pretty well. You might want to just cut the skeleton off the top. And as you do that, you may notice that there's still some green in some of those stems. But if they haven't leafed out by now, you're better off letting the new shoots take over. They'll probably even bloom this year, though not as early as usual. But by mid to late summer, you should be seeing fuchsia flowers on even those fairly damaged ones. And that's certainly good news for getting the hummingbirds to come and visit our yards, because fuchsias are one of the longest and latest bloomers, and they're very popular with the hummingbirds that stick around well into autumn and really through the winter. So that's another class of plants. If you haven't got any, you might want to look around and see some. And again, you've got a huge range. Tom Thumb is a hardy fuchsia that is about 12 to 18 inches high and thrives in partial to full shade. Whereas some of the bigger, more vigorous hardy fuchsias like Maiden's Blush can easily get 8 or 10 feet and takes, as I said, many kinds of soil conditions in stride. They're also, once they're established, they're very drought tolerant, which is another good thing. And they take the heat surprisingly well. Most of them come from mountainous areas in Chile and in Southern and South America. And so they're accustomed to kind of harsh winters, which is good news. But when it gets down into the freezing 17 or lower, which is what the low we experienced on the island this year, you are going to see some loss of top growth on those shrubs. I'd love to hear questions because, as you know, I can sit here and talk all day, but if there's something you're wondering about, please do chime in. I will say I've gotten a very sad number of questions about tomatoes. Why are the tomatoes leaves turning black? Why are tomatoes looking yellow? Why did they actually start to slump? Why did my tomatoes rot? Well, the quick answer is it's too darn cold. We still have very cold nights, dipping into the 30s. Most of them are at least in the low 40s. And that is not tropical plant weather. And of course, tomatoes truly are tropical plants, and they prefer temperatures above 55. But interestingly, they also prefer temperatures below 80. At about 80 degrees, like during that heat dome last year, tomatoes will start aborting their flowers and dropping their flowers. But in that magic zone between 55 and say 78 degrees, they're very happy, and that's what that's where they'll thrive. Well, we haven't had that little comfort zone for them. We might have a minute of it on Saturday. It's supposed to actually be sunny, but we can't count on that. And you have to look at what happens before and after those little sun pockets to see if those plants are really going to be happy in the ground or not. The good news about tomato plants is, you can always start again. They're available really into June usually. Also, quite a lot of regional growers have started growing their tomatoes in greenhouses that are kept a bit cooler than they used to be. Rather than growing them in the with the soil temperatures in the 50s, they're actually going down to the high 40s, like growing them at 48, 49, 50, instead of 55, 56, 58, or even higher. So that means a lot of the well-grown tomato starts are a little tougher and a little hardier than they used to be. Also, by planting them deep, which, they will root. All the little hairs on the main stems of the tomatoes are potential roots. And so when we take those leaves off, snip the leaves off and plant them deeply, even 6 inches deep, so that only their little top leaves are at the surface of the soil, all that former stem will become good, sturdy root system. And that gives them a lot more resilience, so that if the top does get bitten back or gets wind burned today, or gets cold in the night and starts to blacken or get yellow, you will see a flush of new growth from the base, because they will kind of come back from the roots. One of the best things you can do for them too is mulch your tomatoes with used coffee grounds. It does about 3 things for you. It's a high nitrogen release, which is one of the things they need at this time when you're trying to encourage good growth on them. It also prevents slugs and snails from bothering them. Oh. And it's a good antidote makes them very resistant to early and late blights. So saving your coffee grounds and putting them around your tomato plants several times during the summer will be a really good strategy for keeping those plants healthy and well fed.
Are there other plants that are I'm talking specifically blueberries? How about blueberries for coffee grounds?
Yeah, you can totally give blueberries coffee grounds. The coffee grounds, interestingly, are actually fairly neutral. People say, aren't they too acid? Well, the grounds themselves are not. So, they're fairly neutral, and they're always a good. Who else loves them is peonies and roses.
Oh,
roses are gross feeders, and they are always happy to have a little extra snack. So that's another good place to put your coffee grounds. Now, it's important that you shake the filters off, because it's really tacky to have filters floating around the garden. But they can go in the green waste, or they can be shredded up and put into your own compost if you want to.
Very good.
Yeah,
we get the ones that aren't bleached out filters.
Right.
The brown ones. Yeah. So those are probably fairly safe. So.
Oh, yeah, they're fine.
Great. Yeah.
Right. And tea also, if you use loose tea, you can put your tea bags, you can put your used tea on houseplants as a little mulch. And that is also nitrogen. And it also is, it's like gives them a little boost of some of the the plant-based nutrients, phytonutrients that a lot of plants don't get from just ordinary houseplant fertilizers.
Right. And I drink a lot of tea. I could cut my little bags open and take the leaves out, right?
That's what I do. Or
Okay.
if you use loose tea, you can just tip that stuff out and let it dry a little bit and then sprinkle it around.
Okay.
I'm a coffee plant, not for that because I think it's going to produce fruit, flowers and berries, but because you can make a wonderful tea from the coffee leaves. It's delicious. And it has the warmth of coffee flavor without the bitterness. You can't oversteep it. And it actually remains flavorful for like 5 or 6 hot water applications. So I have often a cup or a little pot just going, and I'll just put more hot water in it and drink that through the morning. You'll get a buzz, but it won't be as much. It's less than a cup of coffee, but it's slightly more than a typical cup of tea.
Okay. So you're not too jittery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Another cool the only North American native plant that is naturally caffeinated is called Yopan, and it's from native to the south and southeast and down into northern Mexico, and it was used medicinally and traditionally as a stimulant and a morning drink by a lot of tribal people for millennia, probably. And it was really popular with the early settlers in this country, who were the European settlers who came as well. But at some point, the British Tea Company, which had a monopoly, world monopoly, felt like it was a threat to their sales, especially if you remember, there were some issues with tea tax and our thing, right? But the British Tea Company didn't want to see that happen. And so one of the things they did, which is so bizarre, is they had it reclassified so that its new name was Ilex vomitoria.
Oh.
Which is so weird because it is not an emetic at all. But because that sounded repellent and made people think, oh, this sounds dangerous, I better not take it. And that kind of broke the back. They put out a lot of propaganda about how dangerous it was. And that kind of destroyed the market. Though, of course, lots and lots of tribal people have used it continually and still do. But now, because it's one of those plants that will thrive almost anywhere in almost any soil with it will flourish with almost no care at all and does really well. Even in Texas, I was reading about a drought-stricken area where one of the only plants that was still going great was the yopan. And so people were thinking, well, what do we do with this thing? And that's kind of rediscovered, and they all started drinking the tea, and that turned into a kind of a community thing to harvest and make tea out of this shrub, which I think is kind of great.
But how do you spell yopan?
It's Yaopan, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You might look it up. I can't look it up, taking myself off this Zoom because as I say, I'm on my phone because I'm out of power here at home.
Yeah, I'll look it up. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very vigorous, easy to grow plant. Another thing I'm planting more is olive trees. There are a few self-fruitful olive trees that don't need a partner necessarily. And one of the best ones called Arbequino, which is Arbequino. And that one, there's actually a very nice, happy one at Eagle Harbor Church planted in the parking lot. And it's doing really well. And each year the olives get a little bigger. The first few years they were tiny, like peas. And as the roots take hold and the plant starts to mature, the fruit is getting a little fatter and bigger. But I have actually brined them a few times and made wonderful little snacks. And hardy olives, I mean, what a great thing, right? That's what we're looking at, is a future in which we probably will be able to grow olives and perhaps even one day citrus fruits, which would be great.
I found it. It's Yaupon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you can buy it.
Oh yeah. There's quite a few commercial outlets for it again. You can buy it, but you can also grow it. If you were going to plant a windbreak tree, that's a great choice. And you could grow it and harvest your own. The other thing you can grow yourself is camellias, tea camellias. There are it's been estimated that there are about 5,000 types of tea camellia, all the same mother plant, but selected all over the world where it grows well, so mostly through Asia and in India, but also in other areas. And because they're selected for different flavors and so forth, they actually have a pretty good variety of leaf form. They do bloom, but they're not grown for the flowers. They're really grown for the foliage. And you can grow them in pots or put them outside and harvest the new leaves. And you know how Lipton used to have that, just the tiny little tea leaves?
Mhm.
That most people really prefer the tea that's made with the youngest, newest, smallest leaves. But some people really like a little more robust tea. And then you would pick 3 to 5 leaves off the tip of each branch, which and you can dry them. You can pan dry them and make smoky tea like lapsang souchong, or you can just let them dry out a little bit and then roll them in between your hands to make gunpowder type tea. Or there's lots of online help. You can look up videos and find out how to cure the kind of tea you like best, whether it's a white tea or a green tea or different kinds of black tea. And I actually grow jasmine and it's been blooming away, and I've gathered the jasmine flowers, and you can put dried jasmine flowers in with your tea and make jasmine tea, right?
Right.
Pretty sweet. Or rose petals. And that's another thing you can add to the yopon too, is like rose petals and cinnamon or jasmine flowers, anything like that. You can add those flavorings to homemade teas and they're delicious. And you know exactly what's in them.
Right. Yeah. I never thought about jasmine, but yeah, I buy jasmine tea. I just grow my own. That's a great idea.
How it might have been developed that because the flowers start shedding. And when I was in the greenhouse and some of them dropped in the cup, I started to take them out and oh, wait, duh, make it yourself. And I saw that it really did add the flavor. So I started drying last year and putting them right in with my tea blends. It's like, oh, we can do this at home.
Yeah.
People have asked about what you can plant now if it's too early for tomatoes. And I'm going to say I would hold off on beans, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. You can grow because you're going to plant them in the ground, and the ground holds heat better than the air. So the potatoes are fine to put in now. Onions and garlic, fine to put in now. And you'll be harvesting those in the fall. The winter garlic is probably ready to harvest. If you watch your garlic, and if it starts putting up those big fat scapes that are going to bloom, cut the scapes off. And if you want to, you can make incredible pesto out of garlic scapes, or you can grill them and use them because they curl up really fun shapes. And you can have a little cluster of curled, grilled garlic scapes as a nice side dish or a garnish for something you're cooking. But you don't want them to do both. If they go to flower and start to try to make seed, that weakens the bulb and they don't keep as well. So if you see that, you might scratch down and see if they're really as big as you want them to be. Give them another month or two, but don't let them bloom. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Also, some people are saying that their early greens that they put in February and March have bolted already. I think they're really confused. And so if you cut them back when they start to bolt, you'll often get side shoots that will be just as productive. But if they've really bolted and they're tall and leggy and they're not doing anything, then just pull them out and start again and just harvest all the little bitty side leaves you can. But once they really have gone that far into the process, they're not really going to make a comeback. If you want to, you can leave a few of them and they will, of course, attract pollinators. And if you let them go to seed, quite often you'll find that you have volunteer seedlings. I usually grow 6 or 8 kinds of kale, and I always have some interesting seedlings that are crosses of the various. I have lots of heritage kales, so they're free with their seed, and they do cross still. And it's kind of fun to see. I have, a couple of unique kales coming up in my garden. And the same with lettuces. If they're bolting, then you could pull most of them, but you might want to let 1 or 2 go ahead and bloom again for the pollinators, bringing in the pollinators. And then to see if they seed themselves, you might get your own little crop of mesclun, wild lettuce varieties. That would be delicious. Beans, I've started already indoors, but because it's continuing to really be quite cold, I'm going to say this is probably not going to be a huge bean year, but it's always worth putting some out. But I'd wait a little longer, see what happens next week and the week after. If it is Memorial Day, might be the better time, time to plant things outside. But in the meantime, they can be on a sunny windowsill and do just fine. I love to plant bean seeds because if you've ever planted them, they're the most hopeful plant I've ever seen. You plant this little bean and suddenly the shoot comes up and then there's huge leaves unfurl like angel wings and they just look so enthusiastic and joyful. And then look at somebody to climb up. And I always give them like a bamboo chopstick or something to climb up just while they're waiting for an outdoor spot to open up for them. But they're just so beautiful and hopeful. And I think we can all use a little dose of that right now, don't you?
Absolutely.
Somebody corn was a good idea. To say again, it's really early for corn. The soil is just not warm enough. If you want to, you can plant them in little pots and then transplant those pots outside. Again, probably around Memorial Day when things warm up a little bit. But as long as the nights are still down in the 40s, though, all those tropical plants are going to be less than happy about it. Cucumbers, squash, that sort of thing. Again, probably not going to grow up really, really well. And I've had people say, why are they yellow? Again, it's really cold. So that's just something to be aware of. We can't do anything about the weather.
Isn't the magical temperature 45, above 45?
It's actually 55.
55, because this morning it was 46 degrees when I woke up here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's when I'm saying like the roots are warmer than that because the soil is holding the temperatures a little bit better, but night temperatures do reflect soil temperatures fairly well. So we're not looking at rich, warm earth. We're looking at cold, wet earth. Mm-hmm. And that's when sometimes people have asked me, why didn't my such and such, why didn't they even sprout? It's like, well, they probably rotted. Even peas and beans, and I mean, beans definitely will rot, but even peas, which are good cold weather crop, sometimes if they're just sitting in wet, cold soil too long, they won't sprout. They'll just sulk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Mm.
It's not good news. One thing you can do if you want to, I've also had people asking lately about, can I move my bulbs, like the daffodils and things that bloomed? Some of them weren't in the right place, or now I want to use that area for something else. The best time to move them is actually now when it's called in the green and they still have their foliage and you can still see where the bulbs are. This is the good time to dig them up and move them to where you really want them. Or if you aren't sure, you can actually pot them up and let them go dry and put them under your garden bench or something like that, or in the eaves under shelter so that they dry out and go dormant the way they're supposed to. And then in the autumn, so label them so you still remember what the heck they are. In the fall, you can plant them out as you would ordinarily, and then they'll come up the following spring the way they're supposed to. But this is a great time to divide big overgrown clumps. If you have a lot of the daffodils or tulips that are proliferators and starting to make nice thickets, things like snowdrops or grape hyacinths or those bluebells, all that kind of stuff, this is the really good time to dig and divide. And same for primroses. They often will fatten up and make big cushions. And now that their first flush of bloom is over for the most part, you carefully pick all those bloom stems off, and then you can dig the whole thing up. And sometimes the center will be a bit woody, but all the side bits will be nice. Every bit of the side root that has some rootlets on it and a few leaves attached will make a new plant. So you can dig up a big old fat cushion and sometimes get 20 or 30 or 40 flowers out of it. When they were taking BPA down to do the renovation there, I asked permission and went over and got about 100 of the beautiful little primroses that were growing there for many, many years. And they've self-sowed. So there's orange and yellow and red and all colors. And I planted some at the senior center and I planted some in the community garden here in the mobile home park where I live. And they're already starting to clump up again. And some of them have that sort of clustering nature. And those are the ones that are easily divided and will make lots and lots of new plants for you.
I love primroses.
They're so cheerful.
They are. And it's one of the first flowers, and they're so cheery and different colors. Yeah, absolutely.
Especially orange and yellow tend to have the strongest perfume, and they're really fragrant. The orange ones, especially. If you stick your nose right in there, you'll see why the bees are so excited about them.
So how about bees? Have we been seeing bees a lot?
You know, no, that because it was so cold, there were not very many bees in action. But yesterday when I was walking around the park, I noticed bees on everything. So, and in fact, one plant I was looking and I saw 7 different kinds of bees. So the bees are out in force now that it's gotten a bit warmer. When it's rainy and cold, they're not in business. And, you know, that's why the things like letting the dandelions and the little yard, those little daisies that get in the lawn, leave plants is really helpful for pollinators that are struggling. And maybe they come out on a day that only has a couple sun breaks. They need to find something fast and not spend a lot of time looking for a pollen source, because by that time they've used all the energy they had. So making an abundant pollinator patch is really a huge gift to the pollinator community.
Oh, just a huge wind gust here. Hope the electricity doesn't go out.
I'm still running on my phone. I don't think we've got any power back, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of people were out today.
Yeah. Francis, do you have a question? Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, Francis? There you go. There you go.
What would be in a pollinator patch?
Great question. So there are a lot of plants that have names like bee balm, and that's a good tip that bees are going to really like that plant, right? One thing a lot of pollinators, oh, did the lights just come up? No. One thing a lot of pollinators really like is hardy herbs. So you'll find them all over lavender. Black bottom bees love lavender. You'll see them on rosemary. You'll see them on oregano, which is oregano is a great ground cover. It's not native, but it blooms and blooms and blooms and provides seeds for birds, and the birds know it, and they're all over it in the fall. And oregano is tough, hardy, disease resistant, doesn't need anything, doesn't care if it gets driven over or walked on. It's a wonderful pollinator plant. So if you're looking for a way to get started, some of those hardy herbs they're beautiful. You can use them in cooking, and they're going to be great pollinator attractants. You'll also see, I was talking earlier about letting some lettuce and kale go to bloom. You will see a ton of bees on the kale blossoms and the lettuce blossoms if you let that happen. I often, I like to keep harvesting this little shoots when they go to bud before they blossom. They are wonderful in salads, and you can put them in stir fries and things like that. But I always leave some for the bees, and they're all over them. And I actually saw hummingbirds on my kale blossoms the other day too, because those flowers are very rich in nectar and pollen. And hummingbirds and other birds eat pollen as well as the bees eat the pollen too. They need the protein themselves. They don't just collect the nectar, and they're not just carrying that pollen back to feed their babies. They're actually using some of it themselves. So anything we can do like that. Also, a lot of native wildflowers are excellent for our native bees. And that includes California poppies, which are really easy and fun. And something that's sold as Farewell to Spring, or Clarkia, is actually a Northwest native. It's been bred quite a bit, so there's lots of different colors available. And if you grow them and let them put themselves to seed, eventually you'll get mostly pink. And those are the sort of reverting to type, back to their normal type. But they're easy and eager to bloom, and they bloom for months. They're really quite lovely flowers. And baby blue eyes is another really cute one. That's a native that you can get seed packets of from Ed Hume or some of the other seed companies. And they'll come up like mustard and cress. And once you sow them and let them go to seed, they'll come back year after year. Another one I love is called the fried egg flower or limp. And they are white petaled with a golden center. And they look like little fried eggs from Happy Chickens. They're adorable. And that's another one that will proliferate and grow very well for you once you get them started. So you can buy one packet of seeds, scatter them around. One thing I do when I'm doing that is I put a few in a little 4-inch pot or something in the same area, and I'll put a label in it, because when they come up, you might not know what they look like, and you might accidentally weed them all out thinking that, oh, look how much that weed is going here. So I want to teach myself how to remember what they look like. So I put a few in a pot with either a label, or I'll put that blue painter's tape on the side and just write on it. And then you can see what they actually are. And that's a good thing to do with like baby bulbs too. Remind yourself that a lot of them look like grass when they first start coming up. And then you have to really look closely and go, oh, they're little tubes. They should look more like baby garlic or onions. And then you can see that actually they're tiny bulbs if you pull them up. And then you can remember not to pull all of them up. I don't know how many times in my early years, I would carefully throw seeds around and get them all started and then be surprised that nothing happened, and then realize, oh, I think I weeded them all out.
Oh.
Yeah, easy to do. But we have native lupins and things too. Lupins, I think of as kind of passenger plants. They don't really pull their weight because they're beautiful for about 10 minutes. And then they make a big leafy mass, and then they get mold and mildew and they look terrible. If you let them get to a certain point and then cut them back, they will refurbish and look a lot nicer. But really, unless you adore them, they're kind of, to me, they're not necessarily worth the space unless you have a really big garden. But there are some wonderful, beautiful Northwest natives, and they're starting to be more available. So that would be a good place to start. And again, all the hardy herbs, if you grow thyme, oregano, sage, different kinds of rosemary, there are many, many kinds. All of those will be very attractive for pollinators. As far as other kinds of flowers, they tend to like single blossoms rather than the dense doubles, because you'll see that if you see bees trying to struggle their way into a double flower, they can't really do it very easily. They can't access the goodies. So you tend to like single zinnias will get visited a lot more than doubles, or single roses even, because they're much more easy to get at. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another great one is calendula. And I've talked about this a lot. Calendula or calendar flower is a Northern European flower. They're native in Italy and point south. And they just bloom and bloom and bloom. And on a mild year, they'll bloom all through the winter, not heavily, but there'll always be a few blossoms. And that usually they're kind of yellow to orange. There are new ones like Cafe au lait that's kind of almost a biscuit tan or beige color. There's almost pink ones now. And that's a beautiful family to get going. And they self-sow abundantly. They are huge pollinator favorites. And I just love them for the cheerfulness. They're beautiful plants. And like I said, they do often bloom through the winter. And what could be more pretty in a little vase than a few brilliant yellow and orange flowers on a gray day? I love them. And probably my final choice would be sweet alyssum.
Oh.
And it smells like honey. It's extremely attractive to a wide range of pollinators. And it is effortless. And when those, they might bloom out. And then what you do is when the plant starts to dry out, you pick it up, you pull it up by the roots and turn it upside down and shake it like a salt shaker and scatter those seeds around. And remember that, put a little marker there so you remind yourself that whatever comes up is meant to be there. It's a good idea to get familiar with common weeds in their early stages. And one way to do that is to take pictures on your phone, if you have one, or make a quick sketch and say, I'm not sure what this is. So make a sketch of it and then come back in a few days and make another sketch. And then within a few days or a week, you'll start to be, oh, that is that stinky bob. That's that wild geranium. I need to get that out of here. Or, oh, look, it's bindweed, or whatever it is. You want to learn the vocabulary of form from seed to a mature plant, so that you can be sure you're taking out the right things. I hope that's daunting. It's actually really fun. And what you'll notice is the weeds grow a whole lot faster than anybody else. So if blooming out of the ground and thriving, it's probably not really what you want.
Anita, you have a question, Anita? You can unmute. There you go.
Yes, I would like to know, I'm house sitting and I'm taking care of a Cape primrose and it has a couple yellow leaves. Is it okay to pick those off or are they taking too much nourishment from the other leaves or is it better to pick them off?
Oh, that's a great question. So Cape fuchsia is semi-evergreen, which means in a very mild year, they remain completely evergreen. In a hard year like this, they might lose quite a few or even all their leaves or most of them. The yellow ones are probably ones that are overwintered. And so you can certainly pick them off. If there's any sign of disease, which there probably won't be because they're very tough and hardy, you don't just put them in the green waste or something. Don't put them in compost if there is such a thing. But yeah, they're very tough plants and they should be coming back with very strongly.
Thank you.
I'd say it's hard for them. Kind of nice, right?
Laura, do you have a question? Laura and Bonnie?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But this is
Hi,
Bonnie.
Bonnie.
I have, our yard was landscaped about 20 years ago, I think. And it's full of bulbs and I love them. There's crocus and other things, but I've been trying to thin some and I have 3 different kinds of irises. And one of them is what I would call like Siberian iris and the others are taller. They were just really thick and matted. So I dug them out. I moved some of them and I put some back in a spot and they have just like exploded. There are so many iris there and there are little shoots growing up by the big ones. And when I take one of those out, I can see that the bulb is like growing more bulbs around it. Is there anything I can do to contain those, to plant them so I can keep them in an area without having them just run over everything?
Well, short answer, no. I mean, what you do is pot them up and donate them to somebody else and just keep 1 or 2 plants. There's certain plants like that. Siberian iris are notorious for overcrowding themselves, and then blooming very sparsely, if at all. And then once you divide them and give them fresh new soil, they just go to town. But
Okay.
kind of a plant that you do have to think about, know that you're going to be dividing them in English gardens, they're divided every 3 to 5 years to make sure the bloom remains really strong. That's kind of more than most of us would bother with. But you would know that you are not going to be able to just leave them indefinitely and that they will just keep on spreading. And you might choose, do you love them intensely or do you only like them okay? Habitat for Humanity is very happy to get starter plants like that are tough and enduring and can grow in a new soil with new gardeners. And maybe, they don't need finesse plants at some places. And sometimes schools or churches are happy to have plants like that. Another thing that's similar would be hostas and daylilies, which both tend to many of the varieties will get very dense and overcrowded and then not bloom well, if at all. And some of those need to be dug and divided periodically as well.
Okay, so I would keep sort of like taking out the ones changing them over.
Yeah, I mean, you dig out the mother clump and then you can usually see quite easily which pieces are going to be productive. And often, as I was talking about with the primroses, the core will be woody and not so good, and that you can just compost that. But the outer pieces that have strong roots and good shoots coming off the top, those are ones that are going to be strong and proliferate well. Now, most iris doesn't really want to be buried very deep. They like to have the top of their root, the big storage root, exposed. So if you bury them too deep, a lot of times they won't do particularly well. Sometimes they'll even rot. So that's just something to think about, making sure that
I'm no longer allowed to plant bulbs because I plant them too deep.
Okay, the other bulbs that I attempted to control because some of them are in big clumps are just crocus and then another. But the small bulbs that have long stems with either white or purple or blue flowers, I don't know what they are, but I tried to, I split them because the clumps were heavy and weighing on themselves. And they also just grew like mad in that same spot. They're like twice as big as where I dug them out.
Yeah, it sounds like they might be,
Anything?
they're probably Spanish bluebells, or so-called, which can be pink, white, or blue, or sometimes purplish, and they're
Yeah.
extremely strong growers, and they're really hard to get out because they also bury themselves quite deeply. Like if you plant them shallow, they'll pull themselves down so that it's hard to get out. And so when you dig one out, you're probably going to leave a few baby bulbs behind, and then they'll be up in a year or two. You'll see those in their place. So one way, if you have too many and you actually don't want that many, you can just keep pulling the foliage off, which encourages, eventually shrinks the bulb to where it's not productive anymore. And, you know, again, it's a great pollinator plant. They do love those. Have a woodland or any wooded areas under trees where other things don't grow. Those sort of bluebell type bulbs will do great in those situations. If you look down at Waterfront Park where they cleared all the undergrowth out of under the trees, they put in a whole lot of Spanish bluebells, and they're actually doing pretty good.
Okay. So if I'm attempting to split bulbs to sort of thin them in that area, I might just produce more, which is what happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, so don't put any back. That's what I'd say. Take out whatever you can and don't put anything
Okay.
back. And don't
But some will still be there.
Yeah, pretty
Okay.
much. But if you want them out completely, like I said, just keep pulling off the top foliage every time it starts. Actually, I let it get, 5 or 6 inches high, because you want the bulb to be expending as much and stored energy as possible. And so let it do its job and then rip it out. That's a technique for getting rid of blackberries and things like that too, is to let them, and then when they've spent a lot of energy, cut them down and make them do it again.
Okay, well, yeah, they're I like where they are, but they're encroaching on other things, and so I wanted to reduce them, but I seem to have multiplied them, helped them multiply. But okay, I'll take your advice and do a few of those things.
Yeah, see what happens.
Thank you.
Sure.
Francis.
I have 2 quick questions. I hope they're quick, or hope I'm not getting too much time in here. One, are there pollinators that thrive in shade?
Oh yeah, there are. So if you grow plants that bloom in shade, you'll often see pollinators on them. They're not always the same ones. The European honeybees are what's called opportunists, and they'll go anywhere and take anything. But a lot of our native bees are specialists a bit more. There's some that really prefer the blueberry clan, and they're all over the huckleberries and they're all over the blueberries, but they don't necessarily go to the roses, say. So what you'll see is like a lot of the native plants that we have that bloom, like ocean spray or the Western mock orange, will have its own pollinators, native pollinators. Nick, can you stop doing that for a minute? Thank you. Native pollinators will flock to them, and you'll get some honeybees too. But so plants that bloom in the shade are like coral bells, our native heuchera and heucherella, tiarella. There's some beautiful natives in that coral bell clan that will bloom for a long time, and they attract many, many pollinators. They all do great in shade.
The second question I have is, I have this huge tree in my front yard. I'm surrounded by evergreens in this senior park that I'm living in. So there's all kinds of mess from the evergreens. But this big deciduous tree has, a friend said it's the tree's roots, but they're fine, almost like wire roots that have just spread throughout this yard. And they're really literally like wire, trying to dig through them, to plant something. And I'm afraid I also don't want to kill the tree. And so I'm not sure what I should be doing. But
Well,
I'd like to have something besides dirt around the tree.
here's the thing. In a situation like that, you're probably best off putting in some troughs and putting them up on cement blocks, paving blocks, to give them a little airspace underneath, and having holes in the bottom of the troughs, or really big pots and containers, because penetrating the roots isn't really fighting those established roots is going to be really hard for your plants. You can put in some kinds of ground covers, which will actually do pretty well. Some things that do really well in dry rooty shade, surprisingly, are hardy cyclamen. Those wonderful little, they have beautiful stem patterned leaves and beautiful flowers like astonished butterflies. They kind of look like they've blown out.
Astonished butterfly.
They'll grow great in dry rooty shade. And what's fun is when they're fertilized, the plants that, they're doing this thing and then they get fertilized and then they close up and twist themselves into a corkscrew and tip over and plant themselves into the ground and explode and disperse their seeds. And the ants find them and start carrying them off to other places. And they always drop a few. And what happens over time is you develop this little trail, ant trails, and you'll find baby cyclamen everywhere. And they thrive in dry rooty shade. The other plant that will do really well in that kind of situation is epimedium. And epimediums come in lots of different sizes. Some are evergreen, some are semi-evergreen, some are deciduous. Even the evergreens, I cut them back in January or February, and then you'll see this flush of flowers like birds on a wire, these beautiful little dangly bill flowers, or almost like clusters. And those will grow in all kinds of competitive situations really well, but start with really small ones, like even a 4-inch pot or a 2-inch pot if you can get them, because smaller plants do better when they're integrating into a soil mass that's already had lots of infiltration of roots. Does that make sense? So,
and what is the name again?
Epimedium, Epimedium, or something like that. I think that's right. I'm not the best speller. I usually spell with my fingers and not my brain.
Oh,
Those are good ones.
Anita.
whoops. I had the kale in my garden last year got powdery mildew. Is there anything to prevent that, and is it in the soil? Do I have to even replace soil, or what is going on?
So powdery mildew is very common on squash and on kale and on lots of evergreens and on many shrubs as well. And it's a common where they plants have dry roots. So and also where the air circulation isn't great. If one thing you can do is wash the foliage early on and then spray it with a 10% solution of skim milk. So get non-fat milk and water it down, or you can buy powdered milk and spray it on the top and bottom of the foliage. One of the things that makes plants susceptible to mildews is a lack of calcium in the soil. And our native soils are quite low in calcium, which is why we don't have any native snails except in water, only aquatic snails. Land snails are all imported from other places, nursery plants usually, but we don't have enough calcium in our soils to support snail bodies, and that's why they're all really thin up here. But if you give your squash and pumpkins and kale and greens a little coat of calcium top and bottom, they'll take the calcium into the pores, and each leaf has many opportunities for integrating different kinds of nutrients. And so the skim milk, I know it sounds weird, and about a 10% solution is what you want. And it has to be skim because fat globules will actually prevent the plants from taking up the calcium.
Interesting.
Interesting. Thank you.
Well,
Can I put calcium in the soil as well?
you can, but it takes like decades for it to really be absorbed. Some people like to crush up oyster shells. You can buy crushed oysters, and you can top mulch with those. And that will have the benefit of also keeping slugs away, because it cuts their little bodies, their squishy little bodies.
Okay.
Oof.
Thank you.
Any other? We are running out of time, man. This went fast.